In the far distance is the Nashville Reservoir, which was the site of Fort Casino, and behind it, which you can't see, is Fort Negley. We are on top of a hill that the official records atlas referred to as the Bald Hill, which is known in Nashville today as Love Circle. And as you look out over the skyline of downtown Nashville, you're really seeing what was mostly the whole city of Nashville in 1864. Whereas today's suburbs were the plantations of 1864. All around Nashville are a ring of hills which were all fortified. This position was never attacked, but like Negley and Casino, it was a fortified position. Now our view now is to the east, and we're going to walk around the top of the hill and trace some of the movements of the U.S. troops now. Our view on this side from the top of the Bald Hill is approximately to the west. You can see a tall television tower on the horizon, and Confederate cavalry pickets were across those hills and Charlotte Pike, and off into the distance beyond is the Cumberland River at the point known as Bell's Bend, where the U.S. Navy and the Confederate cavalry battled. But if we were standing here during the late morning of the 15th, not only would we have seen thousands of U.S. cavalry pouring out Harding Pike and moving off to the left to flank A.P. Stewart's line, but we'd have also seen the U.S. 16th Corps of Infantry moving out, Harding Pike below us, and turning to the left across the fields over to hit A.P. Stewart's flank. The view from this point on the Bald Hill is south. The white steeple in the distance is way out on Hillsborough Pike, and that serves as a good point of reference for where the Confederate salient of redoubts were. To the right of that steeple is Redoubt 3, and in the distance 4 and 5. Directly across Hillsborough Pike to the left of the steeple is the location of Redoubt 2, and just a little farther to the left is Redoubt 1. So from this point looking south, we would have seen the 4th U.S. Corps going south on Hillsborough Pike with a short march to go relative to the 16th Corps and the cavalry, which have gone out Harding and are off in the distance to our right, trying to get in position to outflank A.P. Stewart's line.
Now here we are at the Lynette, which is about what the conditions were like when the Confederates were here before the Battle of Nashville. Here's the back of it. Now here's the view that the Confederates had at Fort Negley, and of course Negley had a view on them. Right now, I'm looking at the reservoir now, and what Ross said, that there used to be a fort up there, and there's a house, and as you can see, there's a reservoir. Beautiful. That's on 8th Avenue. Okay, now there's Girl Stadium, and this is on top of one of the walls of the fort. And I'm pan in here. You see there's a wall in between the wall there. This is where they had their heavy guns. And they were shelling the redoubt. The net over there. It's coming a little short though, but I'm assuming, Ross, that's the observation tower. But this is exactly what the weather was like on the day that the Yankees were sitting in camp while the Confederates were out there freezing to death. hungry, they were in this fort staying warm and waiting for the weather to break. Beautiful in the snow. Give you an idea of what it was like over 140 years ago. Okay, that's where I was on that wall right there, looking over up this hill back here. This is another inner fortification, all walled. That's looking at toward the Science Museum. And this is the view they had of Shies Hill, Peach Orchard, and the whole Confederate Army. So they had kind of grasp of what they had. Now right there, to do a slow pan in, is the gate into this back here. Because as you can look from the front, it's pretty high. And you look over here, there's the other gate, in case they could fall back into this area. Unbelievable, isn't it? Here again, we're in the inner fort on top of that hill, and here's another gate that they could fall back in case the Confederates ever got this far, which they probably never would have. But out in the distance, you could see the Confederate lines out there. Of course, they didn't have all these trees and houses down there as they do today. But we're sitting on a real historical piece of property. Okay, then this is overlooking the Cumberland Science Museum. And of course, here's the path I just walked down. And right up there is the gate. And it's really beautiful in the snow. Now here we are, we're in the parking lot of the Sounds for behind. This is Grill Stadium looking at Fort Negley. And this is the outer walls. Where I was in the inner walls behind all these trees. And there's this road that goes all the way around it. And there's the front gate. We're going up there in a minute. Okay, here we are at the front entrance of the gate, the wall, the fort, the outer part of it. And to the left, more walls. And then the back of that's where I was earlier, walking around the fort itself. And these are just outer walls. And this is a scene that we're driving around the fort. And you see the lights at Greer. The front entrance of the fort. And there's a frontal shot of it. We're out of here. Now here's the train tracks on Polk Avenue, and you can see the snow, what it was like. Okay, this is where Ross said the colors troops crossed and got slaughtered by the Confederates that were in their fortifications. And right down there on the far end is where we were earlier. On Polk Avenue. There's the bloody pine. It ran with blood that day from the Yankee black troops, colored troops.
This point on the Cumberland River is the Davidson's steamboat landing. Now, the Davidson house is no longer here. It burned circa 1960, but this was their steamboat landing. After the Battle of Franklin on November the 30th, if the Confederates could have gotten here overnight, they might have interfered with the U.S. Army 16th Corps, which came in from Missouri on steamboats. As it was another day before D.C. Kelly of Forrest Cavalry got here and blockaded the river with his artillery, which was Hudson's Mississippi battery. But they did capture 2 transports that were able to unload mules and some other supplies, and it would have, of course, been here at this landing. This is one of several earthworks that are clearly visible here at Bell's Bend on the Cumberland River. When Hood heard what good work D.C. Kelly had done capturing the transports, they decided that he ought to have a few more cannon, and they sent 2 10-pound Parrots from Hoskins, Mississippi battery. So now Kelly had 6 guns, and it's likely that he had them at 2 or 3 different spots in sections at any given time so that he could control this bend on the river, which he did with good effect. He was able to fire down on the U.S. Navy ships. They apparently were firing a good bit of canister, as his dismounted cavalry would have also been lining these banks. I found one piece of canister in about 1989 lying on the ground, and then I came back and found more with a metal detector later. The people who grew up in this area back in the 1930s said that the canister covered the ground like rocks, and they had buckets of it back in the 1930s. I believe I found 4 pieces before I figured I'd found enough. This is Redoubt 4, one of the 5 redoubts that were along Hillsborough Pike, roughly. This was detached so that it was not part of the main line. It and number 5 were in advance of the main line, which were back along Hillsborough Pike in the distance behind or east of me. In this little redoubt were Lumsden's Alabama battery, supported by a company of Alabama infantry. Lumsden had 4 smoothbore Napoleons. They were from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and on the cold day of December 15th, they had to duel with 24 U.S. cannon, which were lined up in the distance, roughly along what is now Estes Road, just a country ridge at the time. And also off to the left or south were 2 cannon that were with the U.S. cavalry, which were giving them a problem enfilading this position, so that they had to take 2 of the cannons and turn them to deal with those. They were at a serious disadvantage because they were firing against rifled batteries, and they could never really effectively duel with rifle guns, not to mention that it was 4 smoothbores against 26 rifled U.S. cannon. This started at about 11 o'clock in the morning and lasted until after 2 o'clock when the assault was made by over 7,000 U.S. troops. And that consisted of both infantry and dismounted cavalry. The outcome could never be in doubt. When 4 fell, there was hardly a pause, as many of the troops continued on in the distance to attack Redoubt 5, which is a little farther south behind us. Every written source over the years has gotten this part of the battle wrong, saying that Redoubt 5 fell before 4, and that's absolutely not true. 4 fell first, and it's logical that it did because the U.S. troops were coming from Harding Pike off this way, and they would have come to 4 before 5. At this point, you can get a little bit of a perspective of where the U.S. lines were. In the far, far distance, there's an office building or two, and you can see to the right of it an old tower. And that's where we were earlier in the day looking out at the battlefield. It's known as Love Circle today. On the official records atlas, it was called the Bald Hill. So much of this land in this area would have been cleared and nothing but tree stumps out here. So it's hard, again, you have to try to keep visualizing this land in the winter and with the trees cut. This pit here is all that remains of Redoubt number 3. Just behind it, across Hillsborough Pike behind me, was Redoubt number 2. And off in the distance, we can see where Redoubt number 5 was located. This property was purchased by the Battle of Nashville Preservation Society. It is Redoubt number 1. We spent a good bit of time clearing this and were surprised that we could see downtown Nashville once it was cleared. We had not anticipated that. The troops that held Redoubt 1 were almost certainly from Adams's old brigade. Of course, General John Adams had been killed at Franklin 2 weeks before and was now under Colonel Robert Lowry. It was all Mississippi troops, less than 700 of them, perhaps 150 here in the Redoubt, and the others in the line over toward the Unitarian Church to our right or east of here. They would have been able to have seen downtown Nashville as we can now. Some of the taller buildings are blocking the view of the state capitol, which they would have been able to have seen on the hills ahead. At this point, the Point Coupé battery of Louisiana helped cover the withdrawal for Loring and Walthall. Redoubt 1 is in the distance behind us. Hillsborough Pike is in the distance here. Off to my right, Walthall's line was being outflanked late in the afternoon, and Stewart ordered both Walthall and Loring to withdraw toward the Granny White Pike. And everyone who witnessed the Point Coupé artillery on this hill credited them for allowing the safe withdrawal. This is Belmead, the home of William Giles Harding. As you can see on the front of the house, built in 1853. He was a militia general in the days leading up to Tennessee's secession and had been arrested and imprisoned at Mackinac in Michigan. The house went through quite an ordeal during the war, with U.S. troops coming through, harassing their slaves, killing their livestock. They had a deer park. They had buffaloes roaming in the distance behind the house, and most all of this stock was killed by the U.S. troops during the occupation. Now, after the battle started, the U.S. cavalry came out Harding Pike here and had found General Chalmers's wagon train at the racetrack on the other side of Harding Pike. Chalmers had been here using this as his headquarters, but he had been fighting on Charlotte Pike on this day. But he thought about getting his wagons as the twilight hours were coming on, and he sent his escort over here, and they came up behind the house realizing U.S. troops were on the lawn. These Yankees here had no clue any Confederates were nearby. The Confederate cavalry came riding around from the back of the house, surprised the Yankees, drove them down the lawn toward Harding Pike, where U.S. reinforcements just happened to be on hand. The Confederate escort, seeing the situation they were in, withdrew. And at this point, one of Harding's beautiful young daughters, Celine, ran out on the porch, waving her handkerchief, trying to rally the troops, begging them to stay. But they were veteran cavalrymen. They knew they were outnumbered and had to go on. And as Celine stood there, the U.S. bullets were flying about, hitting the columns, and we can still see those bullet marks on the columns today. We're on top of Peach Orchard Hill now, and traffic now buzzes through the top of the hill because Harding Place was cut through here in the 1960s. The line on Peach Orchard Hill was facing the U.S. Army. It ran east-west. But then somewhere close to where we're standing, it turned 90 degrees and ran south in this direction, and then made yet another 90-degree turn to the east. The U.S. troops that attacked this position were under the direction of General Stedman. It appears that he sent in U.S. colored troops in the advance lines. Behind me was an artillery position, Stanford's Mississippi Battery, 4 Napoleons with slight earthworks which they had built during the night of the 15th. Stanford's battery was firing canister, and we know this because people with metal detectors in this neighborhood have found so much canister and various other types of shells that were being fired. But as the U.S. colored troops approached, I believe that the canister fire from Stanford's battery disturbed them. This was new for them to charge artillery. These were inexperienced troops, and when Stanford's battery opened on them, I believe that to a large extent they tried to avoid it by going this direction to the east, trying to avoid that battery, and then focus their attention on this last section of the line. As they focused on the last part of the line, they're marching south, and about where we are, their line becomes enfiladed, because as you look south here, across Harding Place to the south, was Stovall's brigade, and he's got 3-inch rifles in the Eufaula battery from Alabama, and I believe the fire of his brigade with those 3-inch rifles seriously disrupted any chance of success the U.S. colored troops had in their attack. Their officers indicate how badly their lines were enfiladed and how they fell back quickly some distance back, probably close to where 100 Oaks Mall is today, and they were so disturbed that they were afraid that the Confederates were going to counterattack. Now, oddly enough, that was what Hood's really only hope of ever taking Nashville was. He hoped that he would repel an assault and somehow make a successful counterattack. This was his one great opportunity to launch that, yet the officers here, such as Clayton, who was in command of the division, and above him, Lee, who was in command of the corps, did not want that to occur. They were afraid they might lose their position by attempting a counterattack. Now, in the distance here, you can follow Harding Place to Shies Hill. In the far distance, there's Shies Hill, and look at the hill south of it to the left, and the Confederate line stretched back onto it. And then finally, there's a third hill that has a tower on it, which may barely be visible. But this is good weather to look at this, because this is the sort of weather we had for the battle. The U.S. officers in their reports described how the day became rainy, and the rain turned into spitting sleet and snow flurries in the cold evening hours. We've got the feeling of the battle here, looking at this dismal, dismal day. It's conceivable that virtually every Confederate soldier in the line could see or at least sense what's happening at Shiloh Hill. As it falls after 4 o'clock on the afternoon of the 16th, here on Peach Orchard Hill, we're looking at virtually the entire Confederate line. Off in the distance, it goes behind earthworks and a stone fence headed toward Shiloh Hill. And they would have had their morale tested to watch that line fall, and the whole line fall in this way. But Stovall's men on top of this hill stood their ground. We're still really on the slopes of Peach Orchard Hill here. If you follow the old stone fence, which was used as part of General Holtzclaw's line, you look up the hill in the distance across Franklin Pike, and that's where Stanford's battery was. Mississippi Battery of 4 Napoleons, which severely disrupted the U.S. colored troops' attack. But even when artillery didn't come into play, the infantry here really shot apart that attack. These troops came out of woods from the north, and as they came across this open stretch, the Confederate troops waited for them and were taunting them and jeering them to come on, come closer. They gave them 2 volleys, and with 2 volleys the attack was over. They said that most of the U.S. colored troops threw down their guns and ran. This attack was so quickly repulsed that these troops fell back in the distance, and the Confederates were elated, as elsewhere on Peach Orchard Hill. They wanted to counterattack, go forward. The U.S. colored troops and the other troops of the U.S. 4th Corps have fallen back into the distance, expecting a counterattack. But as the afternoon wore on, the U.S. artillery fire continued to pound Stanford's battery. His 4 Napoleons had to duel with up to 18 U.S. guns at a time. Those guns would have been rifle guns, more powerful, with better range. By the end of the day, Holtzclaw recalled there was probably not a wheel left serviceable on any of those 4 cannon. They had to abandon them because the spokes had been blown out of them, the hubs were collapsing. Stanford's brave stand had cost him his battery. Now, I should back up and say Stanford actually had been killed at Resaca, but Stanford's battery stand here was a crucial part of holding Peach Orchard Hill. We're at where Leland Lane passes through the stone fence. The stone fence was the primary defensive feature in Hood's line on the 16th. At the left, of course, Shiloh Hill, and off to his right, Peach Orchard Hill. The historical marker Metro has put up here is from 1967, and the text is not incorrect exactly, but it is only half the story. It mentions Loring's division of Stewart's Corps being here. Loring's division was to the west of Leland Lane, but when you get to Leland Lane, headed toward Peach Orchard Hill, it's actually Sharp's brigade of Johnson's division. These 2 brigades are all Mississippi troops. Featherston's Mississippi Brigade on the west side of Leland Lane, Sharp's Mississippi Brigade on the east side of Leland Lane. These troops were, according to the reports of all of the commanding officers, Stewart, Lee, Hood, these troops had no problem repelling some of the smaller attacks that were made during the day before Shiloh Hill fell. They even remarked that the men were yelling to come on, come back and attack us again. This fence is similar to the fence that Lee used at Fredericksburg, so it's an excellent defensive position. Only the fall of Shiloh Hill led to this line being outflanked. The troops that were in the center were probably 5,000 men. Both the division of Loring and the division of Ed Johnson were about 5,000 total. And they were attacked by portions of the U.S. Army's 4th Corps and the U.S. Army's 16th Corps. It's difficult to say exactly how many troops the U.S. Army would have brought to bear on this position, but the fact that they were being outflanked with the fall of Shiloh Hill made their numerical advantage somewhat irrelevant. When your line's being outflanked, a smaller number could conceivably outflank your line. Hood had his headquarters at Travelers Rest until the 15th, when he moved a short distance over to the residence of the Lees, and we're in their yard now. Now that old mansion has long since disappeared from the landscape of the battlefield, but this is the point where I believe Hood would have watched Shiloh Hill collapse. Behind me is Shiloh Hill. Then this next hill, and right here, would have been where Cheatham's old division was. It had gone to Brown, who was wounded at Franklin, and this day, for the first time, had come under a brand new commander, Mark Lowry. So you've got troops that aren't familiar with their commanding general. And on the left, there is another hill with a tower on it. That is essentially the end of his fortified line. Earlier in the day, on that hill, Govan's Arkansas Brigade was pushed off by the U.S. Cavalry, which was getting into the rear of the Confederate line. And these were good troops. The Arkansas troops thought highly of their own fighting prowess. They thought they were like Texans, and they generally were successful throughout the history of the war. But on this day, Govan's people were shoved off of that hill. Govan was shot. Colonel Peter Green stepped up. He was shot. So they're in a chaotic situation. They retreat down the hill, losing it to the U.S. Cavalry, which are fighting dismounted. Then Manny's old brigade under Colonel Field is ordered to retake the hill. So this brigade of Tennesseans charges back up the hill, recapturing prisoners from Govan's brigade, capturing U.S. Cavalry, and retaking the hill. My understanding is they held that hill until Shiloh Hill fell. Now back to these center hills, the Confederates managed to get 2 artillery batteries into this position. I believe Phelan's Alabama battery was on top of the hill, and in the little valley between it and Shiloh Hill was Turner's Mississippi battery, which had done such good work at Chickamauga, holding Cheatham's line. You look at some of these artillery batteries that are going to get captured on the 16th, and they had glorious histories. Down below us in this area was a huge artillery park with numbers of batteries that never got into position. There were 2 guns left of the Washington Artillery of New Orleans, and they had begged A.P. Stewart or anyone to find them a position because U.S. artillery fire was coming in from various directions and hitting in the background here. When Shiloh Hill finally falls late in the day, I believe Hood was here. You think about Hood's past and how he'd seen so many glorious victories with Lee and had never seen an army under Lee abandon a field in confusion. And here he said he beheld that for the first time. And I believe as he sat on his horse, he was probably about where we are now, watching the troops come down off of Shiloh Hill with no real hope of rallying them. Right now, we're on a range of hills much higher than Shiloh Hill, south of Shiloh Hill, which you can see here. We're on one of these large hills that generally are called the Harpeth Hills, as the Harpeth River is some distance somewhat parallel and south of us. Now as we look north, you've got the best view of Shiloh Hill you're generally going to get without getting into an airplane, helicopter. You can see the shape of Shiloh Hill, and at this point you're looking at the back of where General Bate had his line. He's got the Tennesseans at the very top of the hill. They're called Tyler's Brigade. General Tyler's not with them. He's gone due to a wound. Young General Thomas Benton Smith, 26 years old, is in command of this brigade at the top. This is where Colonel Shy, the hill's now named after, Colonel Shy of the 20th Tennessee, is killed on top of this hill. They found a bullet to his brain. U.S. troop probably came right over the slope of the hill, got to the top, and shot him at point blank range. They claimed later when the family came to get his body, they found it stripped of its clothes and pinned to a tree with a bayonet. And now you've got another view of where Cheatham's old division, which had been Brown's at Franklin, was on this next couple of humps of hills. And then finally, you see where the, so to speak, entrenched line ended, where the towers are, the left of the line, where Govan had been. Yeah, that's really it. It's just the view. I mean, this is just the best view of Shiloh Hill you're going to hardly get. It's hard to get any kind of better view of it that shows the shape of the hill. Do you think it's pretty cool? Yeah. Because you know what that next hill is way off there with the tower on? That's Redoubt 5. Where? Right through there. That hill in the distance with the tower. The cell tower. That's Redoubt 5. You may want to shoot it, but we can probably get a better shot of that hill at another point.
Come back here and look at this.
We're on Shiloh Hill now, and this is another one of the Metro Historic Commission markers, which indicates it was put up in 1967, right after the centennial of the battle. It mentions that Thomas Benton Smith was captured here. After he was captured, a U.S. colonel came up on horseback and began beating Smith over the head with his sword. Smith's brain actually oozed out of his skull. They didn't think he would live. The Yankee surgeons put him on a cot over to the side and tended to other people, thinking he would never live. And ironically, he did until 1923, although most of his life was in the insane asylum, which was until recently over on Murfreesboro Pike. Another tragic story here is Colonel William Shy of the 20th Tennessee. Killed with a bullet to his brain at point blank range. His family comes from Franklin, not far away, to get the body. He finds it stripped of its clothing, bayoneted to a tree. Even worse, not too many years back, his coffin was dug up at the old family home down along the Del Rio Pike at Franklin. And some sort of fiendish ghouls had taken his body out of the casket looking for artifacts they could steal. The body had been so well embalmed that an expert from the University of Tennessee thought it was a recent burial, even though the coffin was iron. Now we're on top of Shiloh Hill. Shiloh Hill is generally associated with the 16th, but actually there was fighting here on the 15th. Hood had come up here to observe the fighting. If we look north, we can look toward Hillsborough Pike, where Hood's left was stretched out. Hood was watching as the redoubts fell. 4 had fallen first, followed by 5, and this allowed his line to be outflanked. U.S. troops are coming at his left from 3 directions. They're coming from the north, from the west, and now they're moving northward from the south. He sees this, and at this point, A.P. Stewart had notified Walthall and Loring they were going to have to pull out. Walthall had already made the decision that he was going to have to pull his division out. And the only troops that made it to Shiloh Hill that evening was Ector's old brigade, which had started the day over on the Harding Pike. And they worked their way toward Shiloh Hill here, and Hood saw them. They were largely Texans and North Carolinians. Apparently the Texans came up first because Hood spoke to them and he said, "Texans, regardless of what transpires, hold this hill tonight." And they did. Elements of the U.S. 23rd Corps attacked them, and it must have been almost black at that time of day. This small brigade was badly outnumbered by the 23rd Corps, and probably darkness saved them, and the U.S. troops didn't realize how badly they had Ector's brigade outnumbered. Along the top of Shiloh Hill, you can still see a faint trace of where the earthworks ran. These were built in the dark, and they built them too high up. We're at the top of the hill rather than lower at the military crest. This led to a severe problem when the fighting began on the 16th, because when the U.S. troops began their ascent, the Confederate troops on top of the hill here, which was Thomas Benton Smith's brigade, were only able to get off 1 or 2 shots behind their earthworks. It was about 3 o'clock when a U.S. Brigadier, John MacArthur, became impatient and decided to start making arrangements to assault Shiloh Hill. His troops attacked at 4 o'clock without definite orders to do so, and the Florida Brigade was on the slope of the hill, and accounts agree that the Florida troops broke first. There's only about 500 to 600 men under Major Jacob Lash. When they broke this position on top of the hill, the Tennesseans under Thomas Benton Smith were effectively cut off. The line had been broken. By the time the U.S. troops got to the top of the hill, they were able to virtually capture Smith's entire brigade here. It's almost dark, it's raining. Some accounts indicate that the rain was turning into sleet, spitting snow. Some accounts have considered MacArthur a hero for attacking the hill and causing Hood's whole line to collapse. But in my opinion, he made a terrible error, because now there was no time to, so to speak, mop up and finish off the Confederate army. They were outnumbered over 3 to 1. Had one precaution been taken, this could have been the most devastating battlefield defeat of the entire war. That precaution would have been to have taken even a division of the U.S. cavalry and sealed off Franklin Pike, because at this time of day, the U.S. cavalry has sealed off Granny White Pike in our rear, and only the Franklin Pike as a major thoroughfare is left open for the Confederate army to retreat on. MacArthur made a terrible mistake. Had he been patient and waited, they would have surely found Hood waiting here on the morning of the 17th, made their attack on the morning of the 17th, and then had the entire day to deal with rounding up the refugees. This gap is on Granny White Pike. It's in the rear of the Confederate main line on the 16th. It is obviously in the rear of Shiloh Hill, and U.S. cavalry had much difficulty operating here due to the steep terrain. Ector's brigade and Reynolds' brigade had been sent back here to deal with this threat to the Confederate rear, and those two brigades were managing to keep the cavalry off fairly well when Shiloh Hill fell. Then the unusual position occurs that the Confederates are retreating, and the U.S. cavalry does an about face and proceeds out Granny White Pike in the directions those cars are moving to try to cut the Confederates off on Franklin Pike. We're at Radnor Lake, which is a Tennessee state park. This lake was not here at the time of the battle. It was built after 1910 by damming up Otter Creek, and the use of this water was for steam engines at the railroad yard, which is still over by Travelers Rest today. So at that time, without a lake, we're interested in a country road that came through that gap. North of those hills is the main Confederate line, Stewart's Corps straight ahead, and a little bit to the left, over past the Granny White Pike, was Cheatham's Corps. and most of these troops were able to escape by coming over that old country road. A most peculiar incident happened here as it was just about pitch black dark. In all of this disaster, it's hard to imagine a Confederate offensive action, but Reynolds' brigade from Arkansas actually saw some troops moving on their flank, I believe coming off of Granny White Pike off to our left from the west, and they actually moved forward in a belligerent movement and halted the progress of those U.S. troops. And by that time, all of Cheatham and Stewart's corps that wanted to escape had done so, headed over to the Franklin Pike to the east. Right now, we're in this building, the Visitor Center, looking at this model of Radnor Lake and the terrain. Now, just a moment ago, we were along this black line on this road, shooting across the lake at that gap, and that shows the steepness of some of the terrain back there, where that old country road came through and would have come right underneath the lake today and then turned and headed east over to Franklin Pike. We're at the approximate end of Granny White Pike today, and we're at an entrance to a subdivision where this attractive wall was built out of a brick product. This is interesting because Granny White Pike is known locally as an old buffalo trail, where buffalo out near the Harpeth River of Williamson County would head to a salt lick about where downtown Nashville is. And the center illustrates the cavalry battle that took place on Granny White Pike that was part of the rear guard. After Shiloh Hill fell and the line collapsed, Confederate cavalry under Chalmers had been guarding the wagon train out at Brentwood. The U.S. cavalry mounted up and headed out Granny White, hoping to cut the Confederate retreat off on Franklin Pike, but they were stopped at what has been known as the Battle of the Barricades, right on Granny White Pike. This fight went on well into the night. The U.S. cavalry officer in command, Wilson, said that the fighting lasted until close to midnight before all of the Confederates had left the pike. They thereby really were one of the main reasons that the Army of Tennessee could escape that night. And in the darkness, there was a famous cavalry duel between a U.S. captain named Boyer with our Confederate officer Edmund Rucker. Colonel Edmund Rucker had a brigade. He had fought on Charlotte the previous day. A bullet knocked his saber from his hand, and he had a wound to his arm which resulted later in amputation. Wilson that night put Rucker up in his headquarters.